Hello and welcome to another edition of the Broadcast Newswrap, your shorthand guide to the biggest and most important stories in the TV business, brought to you by the Broadcast editorial team. I'm Broadcast Insight Editor Jesse Whittock, and this week I have no less than two colleagues joining me, Broadcast Editor-in-Chief Chris Curtis and reporter Desiree Ibekwe. We have the lowdown on the landmark terms of trade agreement between the BBC and Pact, and we assess what the departure of BBC's controller of factual commissioning, Alison Kirkham, to Apple means for Auntie and its factual output. We'll also look at how digital influencers and online content creators have been reacting to the coronavirus lockdown, and we'll find out what the broadcast team have been watching at home on telly this week. So let's crack straight on with the show. The first story we're going to look into today is one of two that broke on the day we're recording, which is Wednesday. It is the ending of the drawn-out terms of trade negotiations between the BBC and Pact, the indie body, over the digital rights situation. Chris, you're going to take us through exactly what this means.
Yes, you're right. Hello, Jesse. It's been a long old battle between Pact and the BBC. They seem to have finally buried the hatchet. And it's also pretty clear that the deal that Pact did with Channel 4 has kind of been the template for this. So it's sort of similar kind of principles, really, in that the broadcaster is prepared to give up a proportion, in this case, of the back-end revenues, international revenues generated around programs that it commissions for its channels, and in return the broadcaster gets greater maneuverability for its online player. In this case, what it gets is the much sought after 12-month iPlayer window. It's slightly surprising in some ways that it's taken them so long to get to this point. I think that the Beeb was pretty clear that it was determined to have all its new commissions online on iPlayer for a minimum of 12 months, which seems eminently sensible, right? There's a whole generation of license fee payers who can't quite understand the idea that a piece of content that's been paid for by their license fee shouldn't be available for them to watch for a pretty significant amount of time online on the VOD platform. So that the BBC gets that, it gets uniformity, it gets consistency. Anything we order, you can watch for 12 months. And I actually think the Dissect has been relatively open to that as a principle. They understand viewer expectations have changed, but they always wanted something in return. They either wanted payment, which it became pretty clear they weren't going to get. The BBC's cash strapped like most other big broadcasters, and wasn't inclined to increase the license fee for shows in order to pay for it. And so they needed something else. And they've gone down the similar route to Channel 4, which is being prepared to give away a little portion of their back-end revenues. So there is some recompense for the production sector, and it feels a little bit as though common sense has prevailed on all sides.
We've got Tony Hall here saying that everybody wins out of this situation. Is that the right way to see it, or do we feel that the BBC or the indies will secretly be happier about this? Who sort of comes out best?
It's a bit of a cliche to say it's a win-win, but it might not be huge wins for either side, but I don't see either party as losing dramatically. So the indie isn't getting any less money or losing out in any way, and the principle of the business model for many independent production companies remains, which is create a show for a British PSB. So either the terms of trade apply, or at least the principle of IP ownership applies. Create it, make it a hit, cross your fingers, and then you're able to exploit it overseas. And they continue to do that, and now they won't have to part with quite as much revenue share as they did previously. So that works out for them. I just think it was really important for the BBC. It sort of tied itself up in knots a little bit getting to this point, but I can completely understand the principle, which is this, like I say, this uniformity. Everything we order after TX, 12 months, it's there, feels very consistent, and it will help them make the narrative around iPlayer stronger. So I do think that it works out well. The BBC isn't losing money so much as it won't quite receive as much as it will do if the show is a significant international hit. Well, the vast majority of shows aren't genuinely significant international hits, so it feels like a sort of common sense approach. But like I said before, the crux of it all is that the BBC wanted something, and ultimately they were prepared to give up something in order to get it, and that's why it feels like a grown-up response to what had been, frankly, a little bit of an embarrassing impasse between the two sides for months and months. Both parties were getting grumpy with each other, and you wonder whether the straitened circumstances of lockdown and sort of the big external pressures that have come to bear have sort of refocused minds and made both parties think, well, come on, let's get this across the line, let's do a deal, because it just makes sense, and we need to draw a line under this and move on.
And you could argue that with the Channel 4 Pact deal having been struck last year, with that blueprint already there, as you say, it became more and more sort of confusing as to why one broadcaster could strike such a deal and another couldn't. Obviously, there are differentiating circumstances between what the BBC can offer and what Channel 4 can offer, and how those two broadcasters are structured. But it certainly feels like this is a good win for the sector. I mean, a secondary element to this. This is a small win for distributors as well, as there'll be more sort of back-end money going to producers. So potentially they might be making ever so slightly more cash from their deals as well. So it kind of feels like all parties are happy.
Yeah, I think both parties will be glad it's done and dusted, and they can move on to more pressing matters, and goodness knows there are a few of those.
Another pressing matter for the BBC now is what they're going to do about their factual department, because we've had the news today that Alison Kirkham is moving on, leaving her role as controller of factual to join Jay Hunt at Apple. That's quite a big one for the BBC, isn't it? She's a huge figure there, very influential player within their commissioning structure. So, what's your initial read on that, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'd like to say that we all saw it coming, but it was slightly out of left field. I mean, you can look at it from both perspectives, from the Apple perspective and from the BBC perspective. Apple remains a very small operation in terms of number of people, but those people are well-known, powerful individuals. So Jay Hunt, obviously, running Apple's video strategy out of the UK, liaising with British and European indies, commissioning high-end scripted and non-scripted. She works with a guy called Joe Oppenheimer, who's a film producer, worked at BBC Films for many years. So she had a sort of a lieutenant for scripted products, and now she's got a lieutenant in non-scripted with Alison Kirkham. So still a tight, small team, but tasked with producing a relatively small number of super premium hours, which in many ways is the complete opposite of what Alison's job was at the BBC, where the majority of all BBC hours are factual hours, just the nature of the way the industry works. She has to balance everything in that role, from the very biggest blue chip natural history programs right the way through to what we're going to play at 7:30 on a Tuesday night on BBC Two that we need to make for less than £100,000 an hour, and blah blah blah. And actually, the two roles are in many ways very different. Though it's interesting that a lot of Apple content has been quite PSB sort of related to sort of PSB principles, and sort of particularly their non-scripted. You think of, they've already commissioned the NHU to make dinosaur programming, and there's some similarities, I think, between both Jay and Alison's PSB backgrounds and the sort of vibe, the mission statement coming out of Apple. So in many ways, like I say, the roles are very different, but it seems to be a good fit.
I've spoken to a number of producers about the visibility of Apple and Apple TV Plus. The service itself is still relatively sort of unheard of if you consider what Disney Plus has achieved in the short time it's been running, if you consider Netflix's brilliant results recently and how it's been on such a good run for such a long time. I don't know if that's something that Alison or Jade necessarily can affect, but it's a question, isn't it, for all of those big shows, is how do Apple shows actually cut through when you've got so many competing services?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's one of the things is it's increasingly hard to work out from an outsider point of view what success looks like. So, I mean, what Apple TV isn't really trying to be a Netflix or a Disney Plus where it's reaching out. You know, it's fundamentally about enhancing the value of Apple as a brand to those individuals who have already or intend to purchase an Apple device, and predominantly, you know, a smartphone or an Apple TV box set in the States, and increasingly, I guess, in the future in the UK. So, yeah, look, it's really hard to know, isn't it, how many people watched the morning show, whether it was a huge hit or a massive flop. Certainly did well in award season in the States by the end. Beyond that, you know, how much visibility do we have around the other titles and how well they're doing? Not very much. And probably haven't had anything that's quite as talked about as some of the big Netflix cut-through shows. So you'd be hard-pressed to point to Apple's Tiger King or, you know, their big reality breakthrough, Too Hot to Handle, or anything like that. But they're not really trying to play in that space. They're like an aggregator, trying to be like a sort of rival to a pay TV platform, really. And then I think the Apple TV Plus originals are like the kind of icing on top of the cake. And so you only need a relatively small number of shows to be, as I said, super premium. And I think that's what the strategy is.
So from a digital giant to digital influencers, Des, you have been recently reporting quite consistently on the role that digital influencers and online content creators are taking during lockdown. What have the influencers been doing in the last, let's say, month, Des? What have their focus been?
Yeah, so I actually got to speak to Joe Sugg along with his kind of business partner, Casper Lee, who I watched when I was 13, so I was trying not to freak out. But they're saying that people are prepared. They're prepared for what lockdown can offer them. He said that, you know, he runs a management company with Lee, said that they're, you know, pushing their talent out there, trying to see whether there's any television opportunities. I spoke to Gleam Management, which is headed up by Dom Smales, and he said that, you know, they have a studio arm that are looking to develop programming. Spoke to BBC Studios as well. They have a talent label, and talent is also looking to push into television in this time. So they're really seeing the opportunities that are available there. With lockdown and the fact that, you know, people are making content from home and they've been doing it for the last 10 years.
And are they talking purely about effectively porting what they do on online platforms straight to television, or are they looking to adapt some of that into sort of more classical television formats?
I think they're pretty open to it. I think when I speak to people who manage talent and talent themselves, they say, you know, obviously they want it to be a very collaborative process. It's probably going to be difficult to transpose some of the things that are on kind of digital platforms to TV. People don't want to watch people, I don't know, opening iPods, for example, or something like that. Like, it's not going to kind of translate directly.
The unboxing.
The unboxing, yeah, or mukbangs, just watching people eat. I don't think that's going to work very well.
Mukbangs.
Mukbangs, yeah, it's just people eating an inordinate amount of food, which is you should check it out. It's actually really soothing. I'm
showing my age. I've never heard of that before.
So yeah, it's about kind of taking what they know. They're their own kind of production houses themselves. They have the kit already at home. It's about kind of tapping into that, and however they want to do that, I think they're pretty flexible with that.
How are they practically doing? How are they doing that? What is the development process?
You know, a lot of influencers are happy being on the platforms they're on, but you know, television is kind of a stalwart, is kind of what you've been looking at for your whole life. So obviously they want to get there. Building their brands are important, but also if you get the chance to be on BBC One, like, you wouldn't really think twice about it, I don't think. But I think one of the really interesting things that came out of the conversations I was having was that, you know, Channel 4, BBC, they're making shows in lockdown, but there's a dynamism inherent in like making a YouTube video. You know, you have to constantly think of ways to make content from your house, and sometimes it's boring, sure, but sometimes there's some really interesting things out there. So when I spoke to Dom Smales, he was saying, you know, you need to kind of dig into the platform and look at the things that are out there. People are making video essays. I spoke to one guy called Steph Michalak, who owns a drone camera and cinematic cameras and makes branded content for people like LG. There's a lot that TV can kind of take from talent, whether that's putting them on TV or just, you know, ideas.
And I'm right in saying that Steph Michalak he said he told you that like even flippant ideas turn into video, and I suppose that's something that's kind of quite an anathema to TV production, really, in a way, which has to think much more strategically about pitching for slots and concepts that work for certain channels. So it's in that sense, he's saying that it's kind of the opposite on when you're creating digital influencer talent content, that you need to just react much faster. And perhaps that's something that people can learn under lockdown. It's
hard to kind of separate the wheat from the chaff because there's basically no barriers to entry. But I think there's a lot of really interesting creators doing some really interesting things that are long form. I watched a 40-minute kind of really well produced monologue about the perils of capitalism, and I could see that as like something that would be on, like, I don't know, Channel 4 or something. So I think there's definitely is definitely well worth the investment to try and see what people are doing on there and how to replicate it.
So now on to the what we're watching section of the podcast. What has been on the Desiree Ibekwe viewing list this week?
So you mentioned that we shouldn't go for normal people, and I've been watching that continuously. But other than that,
only because everyone's talking about it all the time.
Because it's so good. It's so good. Anyway. I've been watching this ABC show, Australian ABC, called Please Like Me. It's written by this guy called Josh Thomas, who also stars in it as this kind of awkward 20-something Australian guy. And it's kind of a comedy drama. It's quite depressing at the same time. He breaks up with his girlfriend, you know, kind of comes to terms with the fact that he's gay. His mother tries to commit suicide. It's really, there's a lot, but at the same time, it kind of captures it's filmed very naturalistically, so like there's a lot of awkward pauses, and
it sounds like a barrel of laughs, Des.
Oh man, it's I don't know. I'm kind of attracted to comedies that kind of make me depressed and they make me laugh because the laughs feel more earned, I guess. So yeah, no, it's great. I've never really watched an Australian series before, so it's you know, surprising to find out that it's not all like Neighbours, and some people are awful and having sad times.
And you've also been you've been delving into the back catalogue of BritBox.
Yeah, I don't know. It's so strange because I was like, when I got it, I was like, oh, I'm probably not going to use this, but actually, it's quite interesting. I've been watching like old episodes of Brass Eye and stuff. It's really like, yeah, it's easy to get sucked in. But I've been watching a 10-year-old, I think it's like 11 years old now, a 10-year-old adaptation of Small Island, which is a novel by Andrea Levy, and it's about Jamaican migration, and there's a lot about colonialism and race relations in 1940s London, which again is a barrel of laughs. But it's really good. The cast is excellent. It has, you know, Benedict Cumberbatch, Naomi Harris, Ruth Wilson. I watched the stage show like a couple months ago, and it's just as kind of enthralling and interesting. So yeah, I've been really enjoying Small Island on BritBox.
What about yourself, Chris?
We're just about clinging on by our fingertips, to be honest. What with working from home and parenting a errant toddler and trying to get through the day with countless Zoom calls. So we tend to watch nothing too heavy, slightly mindless stuff if at all possible. I've been enjoying the World Cup reruns. So I watched the England-Germany 1990 semi-final for the first time in 30 years. It was, yeah, we played well though. It was quite interesting watching. We played quite well. In 1990 when it was on, I would have been 13, and my sister's German pen pal was staying with us at the time. So not only did I have my heart broken by Andreas Bremer and co, I had to suffer that indignity with a German teenager in the sitting room at the same time. So that was lousy. And then what else have we been watching? We're on series 4 of Netflix's The Last Kingdom, which is an incredibly bloody and violent sort of Vikings and Saxons epic, which I sort of keep half an eye on while my wife watches. She's very keen on the lead actor, who plays a bloke called Uhtred. So I often stomp around the house proclaiming, "I am Uhtred," but it doesn't have the desired effect, sadly. I'm much more of a Christopher than an Uhtred.
So that brings to the end another Broadcast News Wrap. Chris, Des, nice one for joining us.
Thank you, Jesse.
Thanks, Jesse. I'd say see you soon, but probably won't.
Exactly. Well, I'll see you on another Zoom call before long. And for all the listeners out there, thank you very much for joining us again. We'll see you next week.